RobDalgleish is the executive director of a national United Church initiative to foster new and innovative forms of ministry and to focus resources on the renewal of existing ministries. He is an experienced ministry innovative executive, a visionary entrepreneur, and an organizational adaptation consultant.
My name is Cameron Trimble. I'm the CEO of Convergence, and I am joined by Rob Dalgleish, who is the executive director of the Edge Network, part of the United Church. And Rob and I have been deeply bonded through the whole tenure of our work in these two positions. Rob, tell the story of how we connected, because it also leads into what you do in your job.
Well, Cameron, I had heard about you and the work that you were doing, and was thinking about applying to the position that I've held now for the last 11 years, which was to head up this Edge Network. It wasn't called the Edge Network at the time, but an innovation kind of initiative of the United Church of Canada. I was just in the process of applying for it. So I blame you for my last 10 years. But I got in touch with you and said, can I come down and hang around with you for a few days? And you said, well, I got a lot on, and I went down that Thursday or whatever it was, and just got in the car with you and went around all these places. Very generative conversation, wonderful exposure too, but it really did put me in a place for the interview, for the position, which came up shortly after that. And anyway, they said yes. I was surprised when Michael Blair called to say that, we'd like to hire you. I was sure this other person was going to get it. And I said, Michael, you've called Rob. I thought he'd, missed a line on the, anyway.
That's hysterical.
It was an inspiring time to spend with you. And I know you thought it was kind of crazy for someone you didn't know to come down and hang around with you.
I was utterly charmed. Yes. And we just got in the car and drove across the southeast of the US, because that was the territory I needed to cover, and talked about the future of church and the future of religion. And at that point, it wasn't really in our languaging about the future of spirituality, which is, I think, now a more interesting question, frankly. But we certainly enjoyed the dreaming. So that's what I'm hoping we'll do now. So we've both, the privilege of the positions that we hold is that it allows us to see our systems at a larger scale than a lot of people are granted access. And so you tune into, I think, the trends and the influencers on these institutions, and then also tune into kind of what are the larger trends in the world. And at that nexus, I think, is this interesting intuition about what's emerging in these times. So let's just ponder, when I ask the question, hey, what do you think the future of spirituality is? What comes to mind for you?
I just feel like there is this huge uprising of spirituality, like this a time in which the Spirit is so powerfully and transformatively active in the world. And part of the difficulty for the church is the Spirit does not respect the bounds and the capacities that we currently have, or the structures. What's happening is quite beyond what we've imagined church to be about, and the structures we built to embody that. But I see it both within, not necessarily in the structures of the church, but within, people dreaming about how they can live out their discipleship in new ways, or I call them spiritual entrepreneurs, actually, is what we call them, and imagining new forms of mission, which we call, in many cases, we would call church. They're new forms of church. I guess the Fresh Expressions folks kind of got onto that idea a while ago. But people in the church that are deeply invested in the structures don't necessarily see as church. I often think of the road to Emmaus story, and the disciples are in grief, right? After the crucifixion. And it's actually Jesus is walking along with them, and they don't recognize Jesus right there with them. And until this kind of experience in the breaking of the bread, where suddenly they can see. I see that for the church right now, that there is this spiritual reality that's emerging that has enormous transformative power, is vital, it's growing, it's gathering young people, like it and the church can't see it because it's stuck in grief. So grief is part of the spiritual, it's part of the texture, part of the fabric of, I would even, grief and lament. Grief for what has been and lament for what is, that we're seeing in a new way. So, it's one of the gifts of COVID, is it has revealed some things. It's helped us see some things. I think of it as, and now I'm going quite beyond your question, so rein me in if you think I'm going too widely here. But one of the principles of adaptive leadership is there's a range of anxiety that you need for fruitful change. If it's not high enough, it's not going to happen. If it's too high, the system can, people can get dysregulated and dysfunctional. But COVID has turned up the heat on some things. It's turned up the anxiety to a level where certain things can happen, like congregations going online or something like that. How long we worked to try and help congregations go online, what could happen for rural communities, and then COVID accomplished in 2 weeks what we couldn't do in 5 years. Anyway.
Yes. Yeah. So it's in that way, it's been an accelerator in some places of a kind of change that was already coming. We're quickly moving into a world of augmented reality where, we're probably going to be wearing, well, we're not probably already, we're wearing our tech on our bodies, and, major shifts. And this helped accelerate the faith space into that world just a tiny bit. I'm wondering about your comment about that the conversation around spirituality is really robust, that it's growing. And we're watching a lot of the traditional institutions, religious institutions, experiencing decline or certainly huge stress, big questions of their continued existence into the future. So as you were talking, I started to ask myself the question, is it because we're actually committed to conflicting values? So the question of spirituality, as I'm doing more of these interviews, as I'm doing more research, really seems to hinge on belonging. How do I belong in myself and to myself? So that has to do with, my own internal sense of balance, integrity, well-being, mental health, and depth work, sort of spiritual growth. How do I belong in community with others? And then how do I belong, or what is my relationship of belonging with the sacred, however we would talk about that, and creation is a part of that. And my wondering is that now enough at odds with the values of institutional religion, which says it's for belonging, but then has these silly, now they seem silly, rules about membership or rules about how one can enter into, and, that the disconnect is enough at this point that we've got competing interests and commitments and agendas there, in a sense.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So there's so much there. Like, I've been thinking a lot about as the structures, as it becomes clear that the current structures of the institutional church are no longer able to embody the mission that we're being called to participate in, like belonging, for one thing. the more I find myself going back and back to kind of more basic theological ground, right? The United Church of Canada that I'm a part of is, really big on theological analysis, critical analysis, and so on. And so much so that, if there aren't three theologians referenced in the material, we may not be able to recognize love your neighbor as the theological ground for like what we're doing. What does that have to do with church? Church. I think the core theological claim of the Judeo-Christian tradition is God is one. If people don't belong, what has gone wrong? The United Church of Canada thinks of itself as a big tent community, right? And then people say, but there's got to be a line. Well, there's no line in God. God is one. There's no other. There's no line. So we've got it. Like, that's the big move for the church. Like, if the institutional church cannot embody what God is dreaming for the world right now, then we got to let go of the institutional church. I don't believe the church will disappear. I think what's the thing we're losing is our imagination for what is meant when we use the word. And it's mind-boggling that so much of the conversation I have in the church, still in people's imagination, is a box, book, and preacher on Sunday morning.
Yes. With
pews and membership and all of that stuff. Like, and that's the big thing. No, we've got to let go. And sometimes I have compassion, because what we're talking about is changing people's worldview. Mm-hmm. And that's the home we live in. So it is frightening to let go of that, to have someone come in and rearrange the furniture of the place where we live and the things that we've associated with. But that's why it pushes us back to what are we clinging to that prevents us from actually connecting with the divine or with our neighbor or with the earth? And that's, because God is one. So I think that, like, the reintegrative 500 years of enlightenment, right, is about analysis, Luther, scripture and plain reason, mm-hmm. right? Compartments, dissection, understanding the parts, right down to below the subatomic level, whatever. This pivot, this huge paroxysm that the West at least is involved in, is about the reintegration. It's about the spirit, and that's why spirituality. And here's the thing. We're talking about the church struggling with getting their mind around this. The world is ready for this. The world is crying out for this.
Right.
Our non-faith-based partners in community development totally get when we talk about this stuff. And they're craving for, ritual, community, a language, a coherent framework where they can live out their, what I would call spirituality. And when we call it spirituality, they go, yes, tell me, let's talk more about that.
I'm having the exact same experience. So let's talk about that, because the interesting thing maybe about both of us in this conversation is we understand the institutional church, we serve in it, we get that contour, but we have either projects or partnerships and or companies and other work we do that helps to bridge into some of these other spaces where these conversations have an entirely different kind of energy and make a difference in a different way with a different kind of amplified power, I'm finding, at least in a lot of these business contexts or, in a lot of these collaborations. So tell us about the work that you've been able to do through Edge with these community partners. And maybe you've got an instinct on how they're or that space is actually advanced in their thinking around the future of spirituality?
Well, yeah, first of all, just to say that society's gotten to the point where they're recognizing the primary value of spirituality and of maybe of spiritual practice. That might be a good starting point. And so, but we noticed a lot of our ministry entrepreneurs were imagining projects that had an enterprise format, right? And so we decided, well, we better do, we'll talk to some people in the social innovation sector and see if we can do kind of an incubation space or community innovation challenge. They were like amazed that the church was doing this, and we're all over it. And then we're doing this very first community innovation challenge. And like a couple of weeks before it was actually happening, say, now our people can come too, right? We hadn't even imagined that, but for them, it was just an assumption. We're a partner in this, our people can come. So these would be non-faith-based social entrepreneurs coming to pitch their ideas at we were thinking of it as our pitch competition. We hadn't even imagined they would want to, but it was like, of course, like, why not? So these non-faith partners, universities, increasingly social sector programs around social innovation and social enterprise were like totally all over the church getting into this space, because the church brings some very particular things. Social capital, for example, a lot of real estate. But more than that, we bring a language, a practice, and a community around spirituality. So the tipping point happened for us when they asked, well, why are you doing this? And we said, well, we share your three bottom lines. We want social impact. We want environmental, we want to love the earth in this. And we want it to be financially sustainable. We've got a fourth bottom line around spiritual impact. And that just became more of a hook for them. It's like, whoa, tell us about that. And what we noticed is in the non-faith-based social entrepreneurs, a kind of spiritual zeal that, like, we could only call it like a calling, like in our own language. We wouldn't put that on them in terms of their story, but that's how we would describe what was happening. So now, like, we've launched maybe 600-700 ministry projects through these community innovation challenges. And we built out kind of a whole ecosystem of, grants, loans, and now just recently, like a social enterprise holding company that we're pitching to denominations to take equity positions in social and perhaps faith-based social enterprise projects as a way of making social change, as a way of loving the neighbor, as a way of embodying the yearning that God has for the world. Public sector, private sector, and increasingly academically, folks are just really excited about the church as a preferred partner in this work because of those pieces we bring, the social vision, the spirituality, and the social capital, really, that is increasingly rare to come across.
Right. I think we've always shared this in common too, that the way I would language it is I can't figure out why we need so many congregations in the world if we aren't relentlessly committed to improving the quality of life for the people living around those congregations. And this is one of those ways that you all have figured out how to create some of that shift, so that it's not just how do we maintain these buildings, but how do we use these buildings in service of the common good. And equally importantly, the re-enlivening of the practices of spirit, of connecting to spirit, the rituals that needed some new translating into this particular age.
Yeah, for sure. I'm a big believer that faith communities, whether it's church or not, need to have an opportunity to help people shape their spiritual path, to give them some resources, whether or not they become a part of, structurally the Christian community or a particular congregation. But the world needs spirituality. Like the American Mental Health Association has named spiritual competence as part of intercultural competence for any practitioner in mental health, because the evidence is starting to clearly show that spiritual practice and spiritually based interventions in community are as good as any other intervention and way cheaper. And the evidence is there. Like, I want to name the Cochrane Library as a kind of a source for a lot of this material, and a huge longitudinal collaborative study between Harvard and Stanford around 12-step based sobriety programs. So a spiritual approach to the mental health issue of addiction the evidence is now there that this is, conversion is the most effective treatment for addiction. What psychologically people would call a psychopath can become a compassionate philanthropist through a basic psychic change that we would call a spiritual experience. Like, it's just, the evidence is there, and we need to be, like, there's a 17-year gap between the academy's realization and the actual practice at the clinical level. So I think the church, I'm making a bit of a pitch here, the church needs to take on the job of telling this story to our partners. And that's the other one. Social enterprise is one sector, and that relates to property, but it also relates to just business as a form of ministry. Capitalism, unqualified growth capitalism, leads to winner takes all and everyone else dies, and then the winner dies because they're alone. Charity is a colonial model to really entrench power relationships that are not equitable. And so neither of those really function. Socially purposed enterprise is really the sweet spot for mission. And we're finding this mostly through practice. That's where the energy and the sustainable model seem to be going. But increasingly, I'm thinking theologically, we need to be very suspect of charity-based spirituality because of its over-under kind of relationship. So when people say, what does business have to do with church? I want to say, what does charity have to do with church? We want people to have abundant life. That's the promise that Jesus made, right? And anyway.
No, I think that's exactly right. You're reminding me that there are different kinds of capitalism, and the capitalism of the West that is just this, endless consumerism. I think we've proven is not only run its course, but it can't. I mean, it's leading to our complete destruction. But there are other ways to continue in a capitalist framework that don't have to involve consuming each other or the planet. There's a more sophisticated economic conversation that can be had around this.
And what is the ownership, right? Like the community ownership of the venture is just critical. But also, if you think of the credit union movement, I think that's one of the great success stories of community-based capitalism. If we share our resources with each other around a common bond of association, that's the credit union model at its birth, then we can attend to the common good.
Which reminds me that we have models that either we're creating now or that we have known in the past that point a way forward to a sustainable future. That I think, if I think about the future of spirituality, at the foundational theological level, at the mythological level or archetypal, however we want to language that, sustainability and common care for the common good is like the starting point of any kind of viable future spiritual expression that can scale in any kind of way. So it's a difference of values, I think, that you're helping us to point towards. That's Harper. Pardon the dog in the background in this network. So if you were to offer us a word that we could use as a guardrail and or a guidepost, like a beacon as we're moving towards a future where the world works for more people, where it's more equitable, more in balance, more of what you've just talked about. What's a word that we could hold on to that could guide us?
So there's two words, and they're kind of competing, and one is, more personal. Collaboration. One of the problems of the church and kind of this separation of secular and sacred is that we think we're the ones doing it, like in our own space, and we're going to do it alone. We need to re-enter the commons and collaborate. And if we do that with open hearts, open minds, and open ears, mostly, and a willingness to be changed by the conversation, then I think, then we can embody our theology around, anti-racist, anti-colonial, equity lens, and so on. But if we don't learn to actually be in community and to collaborate, then we won't be able to actually do anything. My sense is, like, Enlightenment separated everything out and dissected it. This putting back together has to do with working together. So we need to collaborate, and so congregations need to be collaborating in everything they do with their community, right? And if you're open to who that is, like, really, you bring all those justice lenses that I know you see Christ and that we put there, then that's it. But just to do the analysis and to think about it without being able to actually collaborate is not going to get there. Even the whole business around allyship and so on, around what that means. And that leads me to the second word, which is really surrender. So this relates, I realize this is coming at a personal level, so it's very much shaped by my own location, that I almost think of Otto Scharmer around open mind, open heart, and open will. And that's to be changed, like the willingness to risk being changed by these conversations, by being changed by what we're seeing, and to act different, and then to act differently, to live differently, to let go of those cherished ideas and frames or whatever it is that we formed our identity on. So that's the place of transformation. Like I almost Lady Gaga, or not, I don't know if she wrote the song, but Shallow, like I just think that's such an archetype of the spiritual journey. I'm off the deep end, right? Like I'm going down, crash through the surface, going deep, and then that surrender, not in the shallows, right? That's a place that we most fear going, and it is the place of safety. That is where we are in the arms of God, when we're willing to surrender those things that we're clinging to, and so that we can just be held. So those are guides, I guess, for me: collaboration and surrender.
Those are good guides. Hey, Rob, thanks for this conversation.
Thank you.